So welcome to our Global Network webinars. Today we are happy to have with us Petra Nahmias from the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP in short, and Gabriel Gamez and Ralf Becker from the UN Statistics Division here in New York. Our speakers will give a presentation on the Handbook on Management and Organization of National Statistical Systems, which has the objective to guide chief statisticians and senior managers of statistical organizations in developing and maintaining statistical capacity that is fit for purpose in a rapidly changing data ecosystem. The handbook enhances the ability of developing countries to strengthen their institutional, organizational, and technical environments in which statistical authorities operate. The handbook is a living document which is published primarily through an interactive internet platform and which is regularly updated. In this webinar, our speakers will discuss the genesis, structure, and content of the handbook. We'll illustrate how the handbook has been used recently, and will explain how the series of thematic conferences will maintain the compendium up to date. So now I will introduce our speakers. Petra is the Chief of the Population and Social Statistics at ESCAP's Statistics Division. She leads the work on a range of topics, including on civil registration and vital statistics, gender statistics, migration statistics, and data integration. She has worked in both international and national statistical systems for nearly 20 years, including for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Population Division, the UK Department for International Development, and the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics. Gabriel is the interregional advisor on the organization and management of national statistical systems at UNSD. He's responsible for the implementation and monitoring of various global initiatives and programs aimed at modernizing the institutional frameworks and governance of national statistical systems. Gabriel worked for the Swiss Federal Statistical Office, for the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, and served as a regional statistical advisor at the UN Economic Commission for Europe. Ralf is the chief of the Statistical Capacity Management section of UNSD. He worked in the UN Statistics Division in different areas such as industry statistics, energy statistics, trade and services, and classifications. He has also worked in a number of expert groups and task forces and is currently coordinating UNSD's work in the Big Data Task Team on training competencies and capacity development. So let me finish by mentioning a couple of practical things. So we will first hear all presentations and we'll then have a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to write your questions into the meeting chat at any time. During the Q&A session, we can then either read the question for you, or you can raise your hand and ask the question yourself. As always, this Global Network webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians at yammer.com/UNstats. We invite you to continue the discussions on the Global Network after the webinar. So now I will hand over to our first speaker, Gabriel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay. Oh, yeah. I spent some time with the first one. I mean, the other one, I don't know if it looks that good. No, I mean, thank you very much, Alex. Just, I mean, to start, of course, dear colleagues, thank you also for being here, and thank you for your interest in the handbook. I wanted also to mention, of course, we're not going through the chapters and the substance of the handbook. you will hear later on, I mean, about our thematic conferences, and there we have them for 3 days. And even during these 3 days, we cannot go through all the chapters, so we ask the participants to select a few. So the idea of this presentation is to go a little bit through the origin of the handbook, the way we have the modalities for its development and drafting, and also how we see it in the future. So that's the main objective of the presentation. So handbook series of statistical organization. The handbook we are going to discuss today is not the first one. It's the last one of a series of handbook of statistical organization. These handbooks, or these series, had as a primary objective to guide chief statisticians and senior managers of national statistical organizations in developing and maintaining statistical capacity that is fit for purpose. It was mentioned by Alex, it will be mentioned by others. So basically, we already, I mean, for the first edition in 1954, we already understood that we have a few guidelines and of course handbook or other documents that help, I would say, the technicians to produce statistics and indicators, or the experts. But what was lacking is actually a kind of compendium that helps the manager to understand what it is about and how to best manage a statistical organization. For the first edition in 54, I didn't find actually the detailed title. I assumed that the title was just the Handbook of Statistical Organization. But we had a second edition in 1980 that was called also A Study on the Organization of National Statistical Services and Related Management Issues. And the third edition, that was actually the previous one, 2003, on operating and operation and organization of a statistical agency. The interest, if we just stop there, is to see that the last handbook were much about a statistical organization and not much about how different statistical organizations are interacting and how this group of organizations that we also call the National Statistical System is interacting with stakeholders, can be users, other data providers, etc., outside the system. So, of course, now if we think a little bit, 2003, this was many years ago, and a lot of things changed. One important element, of course, is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But at the time we were thinking about a new edition of the handbook, we didn't have in mind, thanks God, we didn't have in mind the forthcoming COVID-19 pandemic. But the pandemic also changed a lot because put a lot of pressure on us official statistician. If we focus on the SDG, of course, the number of indicators, the granularity, the timeliness, the reliability, the important element stress on the system, users are requesting statistics, more granularity, more often, faster, etc. With COVID-19, it was probably even more like that, since we were obliged to produce statistics in the last minute, where actually it was already difficult to collect the information because face-to-face interviews, for example, were not possible. But on the other hand, of course, if we have challenges, we have also beautiful opportunities that arose during these last years. I mean, this is what we can call the digital transformation, new data sources, big data, but also geospatial information, administrative data that we often forget and many countries are not using to the maximum extent, but also the data community. We have other data providers, other data producers, other data experts outside the National Statistical Office, outside the National Statistical System even, that we call the data ecosystem. So we have now a very rich data ecosystem, and this data ecosystem can help us actually to raise the challenges that we have. But in order to raise these challenges, we need to transform. And this is where the handbook is very useful, or where we thought about the handbook, is that we need to modernize and to review our resources and capability. We have to work in a more integrated and standard way. Or something that we use often is the interoperability in terms of data, but in terms also of technology. the methodology, the mixed mode. I mean, we don't work, or we will not work maybe in the future only with one data source, but with many data sources, and we have to mix them in order to come to our end product. The institutional environment that is different because we have other actors around us. In terms of capability, the infrastructure, of course, the IT and the application that is needed in this new digital transformation, the know-how, the human resources. We need actually people that are trained differently to raise these challenges. But something that is also becoming very important is leadership, coordination, and partnership. And this morning I was actually intervening in an event that was organized by CESRIC for the OIC countries on coordination of national statistical systems. And tomorrow we'll also discuss data stewardship, very important. So just to illustrate the importance of this element, of course, for the transformation and the modernization of national statistical system. And you can understand that the handbook from 2003 missed a little bit these elements since they were not that relevant still. What was the mandate? I mean, did we receive the mandate actually to revise this 2003 handbook? Of course, it's quite clear that there is a need, that the handbook was old, but you know how the United Nations is working. I mean, in general, we get a mandate, a formal mandate from the UN Statistical Commission, and this happened at the 48th session of the UN StatCom, the UN Statistical Commission, that requested a revision of the current handbook. Actually, they had in mind, when the Statistical Commission took that decision, they had in mind actually the outcome of the transformative agenda, but also the Cape Town Global Action Plan, and they wanted to put these different initiatives into a kind of implementation phase, and they thought that the handbook would be the ideal compendium to help chief statisticians and senior managers to do so. At the 49th session of the UN StatCom, the Commission actually endorsed the outline handbook. So actually we had the chapters that were explained, outlined, and the Commission adopted them. We addressed, the Commission actually insisted on the fact that we have to address the strategic development areas articulated in the Cape Town Global Action Plan, and again about the transformative agenda initiative. They insisted again on the fact that we need to grasp the potential of the digital transformation. I can add in a rapidly changing data environment, but I told you already that. Reinforcing leadership, coordination, communication, dialogue through institutional, organizational, and managerial adjustments. We also presented that before. And then overall updating process to be supported by a series of sub-regional thematic conferences. I mean, the Statistical Commission wanted this handbook not to be the handbook of the UN statistics division, but the handbook from the member states. So basically that this handbook reflects accurately the challenges, the success stories, the experiences of our member states in transforming their national statistical systems. One point that was important and presented immediately at, something happened here. I don't know why. Now it will take a few seconds. Do you see my slide? Are you with me? I don't hear anybody.
Yeah, we see it, but not in presenter mode, just the...
Yeah, exactly. It went away. I don't know why, because I didn't touch anything, but I mean, it went away. So I need to do a couple of things here in order to get it. 2 seconds. 2 seconds.
Yeah, try to reshare it. And
yes, exactly. Something
no
happened. I've lost during a few seconds the connection probably. And then I share it again. Okay. Do you have it again?
It's coming up.
Okay, so
yeah, thank you.
Is there actually, for me, it's there with the thing. I'm sorry for that. I mean, we have a little bit of an issue these last days with Teams. Sorry for that. Accessibility, usability, ease of update. That was something very important. The Statistical Commission insisted actually to conceive that the handbook is conceived as a living document, if possible on the web. Of course, the handbook should not reintroduce methodology, definition, and so on, but use the existing one, those ones that have been approved. They also insisted on a hard copy of Chapter 2. The Chapter 2 is an overview, that this one should be printed and available in all UN languages, but that the other chapters of the handbook could be only available online and in English a priori. And the handbook revised every second year, if possible, with links and country examples, probably more regularly. You will see that this changed slightly, but I mean, basically the idea was there. What we have done is that within UNSD, we have set up a drafting team with experts actually from different organizations, from different continents, actually, that helped us to draft this handbook. I had the pleasure to lead this process. But what I wanted to say, and was very important, is actually the advisory group that guided us. And this advisory group was composed of Brazil, Colombia, Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, Mongolia, Palestine, Philippines, Poland, South Africa, Suriname, and the United Kingdom. These countries actually helped us in drafting the handbook, and I will show you after how this worked. We had, of course, also in the advisory group, the 5 UN regional commissions. I also thank them. And we had, as international organization, FAO, the ILO, UNCTAD, the Asian Development Bank, Eurostat, Open Data Watch, Paris 21, and CESRIC. We believe that with this group of organization, the advisory group was already quite large, and we were afraid that this would block us a little bit, right? When members of the advisory group do not agree, but actually it went extremely well, and it was really, I mean, a very fluid, very streamlined process when it came to the comments that we have received from our the members of the advisory group. Yes, before starting the process, I'm sorry, I have already 2 hours of presentation behind me. But I mean, the thing, I mean, when we started the process, we also consulted widely national statistical officers. I'm not going now to go through the whole process, but what came out clearly from that survey was that the priorities were the institutional environment, strategic leadership, coordination, partnership, and communication. Actually, I mean, you will see the chapters that are reflecting that. Capacity building, international cooperation, actually training and resource mobilization, quality framework and management, business architecture for an integrated statistical production system, and also technological development concerning data collection, data handling, data dissemination, etc. Including, of course, the non-traditional data sources. That came clearly out from the survey that we conducted among all national statistical offices. And I don't remember now the response rate, but the response rate was rather high. So we were very happy with that. So the proposed structure of the handbook actually is based on Gamez and GSPPM. We have been thinking quite a long time, what kind of structure are we going to give to this handbook? And actually, we are lucky enough to have 2 generic models that were developed by UNECE, but are used now widely. Gamez, which is more on the governance dimension, and GSPPM, that is more on the production dimension. And we have used these 2 models actually, or we got inspired by these 2 modules to structure the handbook, and this is actually the outline that was proposed to the Statistical Commission. Now, how did it work? Once we had all that, and the Statistical Commission told us, okay, go ahead, we are fine with the structure, we are fine with the outline. So what was decided, and this is the way it was decided to work, it was to the drafting team to first draft a chapter that we called, or used to call, the initial draft. The initial draft was submitted to the advisory group for a first round of consultation. So I told you before, the countries, the 5 UN regional commissions, and the international organizations. The chapters were then updated based on these comments. We went for a new round of comment, right? The second round. we took into consideration the second round, and then we stored these chapters individually on our wiki platform. And we ask, of course, not only the members of the advisory group, but any interested person or institution to have a look and send us the comments. And we received quite a lot of comments actually on this platform. And we also took into consideration these comments when we merge all chapters into one single document that we submitted once again to the advisory group, took into consideration their comments, and then actually went to the UN Statistical Commission this spring in March. The handbook was adopted, as we wouldn't be here otherwise, as you can imagine. But what I wanted to tell you is that already last year, actually, we came with a slightly revised structure of the handbook, and the UN Statistical Commission told us, yes, this is fine. And this slightly revised version of the handbook was actually used and submitted in the 52nd session of the UN StatCom. We also propose a change in the name, the subtitle, and we wanted to call it Handbook of Management and Organization of National Statistical Systems. You see the difference? Before we were on the organization, now we are on the system, right? Of course, we go beyond the national statistical systems, since we also discuss what we call usually the data ecosystem. So the 52nd session of the UN StatCom agreed, welcomed the 4th edition of the handbook, congratulated the advisory group and the drafting team. Of course, reiterated, and this is very important, the need for a printed version of Chapter 2 in all UN official languages, supported the proposed updating and revision mechanisms. I will tell you more about that under the guidance of the advisory group, and also reaffirmed the importance role of the thematic conferences to inform forthcoming updates and revisions of the handbook. So now, if I go to the next one, this is now just the chapters. Here you have now the structure of the handbook. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through this structure. There is one thing I wanted to tell you. I had to lead again such a process. I believe I would start with the glossary. We ended up with the glossary. That was a very important step, because actually through the glossary, we secured the consistency and the coherence of the entire handbook, because the chapters have been drafted separately, and the glossary definitely helped us. But I believe that we should, or we could have started with the glossary, or at least kept the glossary alive while drafting the various chapters. This would have helped us tremendously. So what are the next steps and modalities to keep the handbook alive? Of course, the handbook is already available, and we believe useful, and Petra will tell us more. And I also told you about the meeting I had this morning with CESRIC and the OIC countries. But the handbook is already available on the wiki platform, where comments and suggestions are still welcome, and they will continue to be welcome. It's a living document. And the handbook is also available through the capacity development webpage of UNSD. The immediate next steps are actually to transfer the handbook on a dedicated user-friendly web solutions. We have started to work on that, and we hope that between September, October, we are done with this, right? We will be able to read the handbook on the smartphone, on an iPad, on a computer, on a laptop. This is something that we definitely want. We believe that chief statisticians are not always on their computers. And then what are the modalities? And this is very important to keep the handbook alive. We will have regular updates 2-3 times a year that are actually concerning adding or related to the new success stories that we get, regional initiatives, updating internet links, and adjusting some factual and uncontroversial is maybe strong, information, right? 2-3 times a year, we will make a kind of little tidy up of the whole thing to keep it, of course, up to date. The revisions are heavier activities. They are in-depth modifications of the coverage, substance, or structure of the chapters and the sections of the handbook that we are going to conduct every 2 to 3 years under the guidance of the advisory group. And for these revisions, we will keep the UN Statistical Commission informed and, when relevant, consulted. I think that this is my last slide, Alex, and with that, I give you back the floor. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Gabriel, so much for this overview of the handbook and explaining how it came about. If I'm not mistaken, we will now hand over to Petra.
Okay, thank you. I shall share my screen. Just give me a second.
Have we lost Alex? But it's not important. It's your turn, Petra, to speak, so you can go ahead. But I think we have lost Alex.
He's still important.
Something also happened on my screen. Some of the squares went black, but at least Petra is still live.
Okay.
Yes, that's beautiful.
Can someone confirm that you can see my screen?
Petra, I don't think I can see your screen.
Okay, let me see why not. Okay, might help if I share it. Let's see. Okay. Right.
Yep, I can see your screen now.
Okay, I'll just put it into slideshow.
Yep.
And let me just swap them out. Okay, how's that? Is that okay?
Yep, I can see the presentation. Yeah, I can see the presentation.
Thanks. So actually, this handbook and the conference that Gabriel mentioned, the regional thematic conferences, they're actually quite close to my heart because it was actually, I started in ESCAP in February 2020, and it was my first mission with ESCAP to the conference, and it turned out to be my last mission with ESCAP since then no one's actually gone anywhere. But it was a great introduction to the work in the region, because the handbook is just so fundamental. What it covers is a system to the work that we do. And we were looking at the reasons why, for our region, why is it important? What's the relevance? And we came up with three key reasons. The first is that it's really practical, and it's about developing and maintaining the capacity that's fit for purpose. And this is something, as official statisticians, it's always important to keep our eye on. We're not academics, we're not doing this. And I know, Gabriel, I was in the meeting just before with Cesaric as well, and I think you did put it very well about how we need to make sure that the statistics are going to be used and that they're guiding policies and programs and meeting user needs. So that's really, I think that runs through the whole of the handbook, keeping our eye on that prize, on the mission and what we're trying to do. So it's very useful in guiding the national statistical systems in developing that statistical capacity that's really going to be fit for purpose. And it's really important as well, that because the last handbook in 2003, the world was very different then. The MDGs, I think they were just starting, of course, this idea of having these standardized development indicators, but the demands were so much lower than as they are today for the SDGs. And even the picture I've put here is of someone putting a tape into a machine, and I put that picture because when I first started in 2000, I worked in the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics, and we had I was working on fertility data, and I was using SAS, and I used to type a command get and blah blah blah. And if I did it after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it wouldn't run. I'd be waiting until the next morning for it to actually run. And I asked a colleague, I'm like, why is it so slow after 3 o'clock? Why is it not running? And she goes, oh, the guy goes home. I'm like, well, what guy? And she said, the guy who puts the tapes into the machine. And this was like in 2000. It was only 20 years ago. So it's not just that the demands and the needs have changed, it's also what we're able to do has changed. The technology has changed, the potential for data integration across the system, the potential from big data. So all of these have changed. Really, the whole statistical landscape is so different to what it was from when the last handbook was was developed. So what's fit for purpose now is very different picture to what was fit for purpose nearly 20 years ago. And then for us in the region, the handbook is important because we're just so diverse in Asia and the Pacific. I mean, we're home to about half the world's population, and we have some very developed countries, very sophisticated statistical systems. We have a wide range of statistical systems. We also have a lot of countries with less developed systems and with very specific needs. So out of all our countries, 55 are considered developing. And out of those, 22 are small island developing states with all the issues that come with that. And then 11 are least developed countries. And then we also have the landlocked developing countries with all their issues. So in Asia Pacific, if we can build capacity here, if we can develop the kind of systemic approaches and the learning that's needed, this can really have global impact. We think that the handbook is also important because it provides guidance for the UN resident coordinator system, which wasn't, really around 20 years ago either. And these resident coordinators and the country teams or groups of countries in the case of multi-country offices, they often are using data. They might have economists, they might have data officers, but while these people, they might be data savvy, they're not statisticians, and they don't necessarily understand official statistics either. So this handbook is really helpful because it provides them with this kind of insight into the national statistical systems, the working of official statistics, which is absolutely necessary for a whole range of reasons, but particularly for reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals and on development indicators, and how to work with official statistics to be able to do that. So we think this handbook is not just relevant for countries, but it's also relevant for UN organizations who are working in the countries. And very specifically, what does the handbook actually offer for countries? What do we find is what could be some really helpful pointers? First of all, it looks at definitions, and getting these common definitions is crucial for comparability and harmonization. So things like, what even are official statistics? And again, going back to this, we had this meeting just before, which was covering a lot of similar items. And Gabriel, you were asked exactly that question, like when does something become an official statistic? So this is where the handbook can come in and say, well, these are the characteristics of official statistics, and this is how we define them. And it demystifies some of the, the terms which are bandied about. So things like, what do we mean when we talk about infrastructure? We're not talking about roads, right? We're talking about something very different. So what does the statistical community mean when talking about infrastructure, so that we have a common understanding when we have discussions and discourse? It also looks at the common challenges that countries are facing and how to, for example, keep professional independence in the region where there's a lot of pressures on statistical offices. How do they keep that level of independence, which is so necessary for there to be trust in the official statistics? And what's really great is it's really practical. There's lots of country examples, and relevant country experiences are documented there. And we also know from our own experience that this is something countries really like. They like to learn from one another rather than theoretical discussions. It's like, okay, practically, how has this been done in a country so that I can learn something from that experience? We also looked at it from the perspective of what can this offer for the UN resident coordinators and the country teams. And again, we went down to the definitions. I mean, there's often a lack of understanding between this idea of a centralized and a decentralized system, having the role of the National Statistical Office, and then the broader national statistical systems with the different data producers and users. The UN resident coordinators are very often interested in what's happening in their own countries. So, they have this place where the country's experiences and good practices and best practice can be documented. It's an opportunity for experience sharing. Again, this is something that we know that countries really want the UN to do, is to facilitate this kind of sharing of experience and peer learning, so that they can see how other countries with the same challenges are approaching them. For how do we COVID and responding to COVID, conducting a census under COVID conditions. This kind of experiences that the countries really like to share with one another. And then also it's got good references. So, you know, opportunities for staff to develop their own skills. And then finally, what else does the handbook offer? Well, we saw it as being almost like a catalyst. So it's not just the handbook itself, but we can use it as we're doing now for webinars, for discussions. We can we have workshops and capacity strengthening using the handbook as the catalyst for doing so. It can lead to further discussions. And we also thought it's useful as it provides a way to systematically assess development priorities, such as for an NSDS or for a development system cooperation framework. So, you know, I think kudos to everyone involved in this work. We see it's been very useful, and we really look forward to taking it further in our region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra. Sorry that I stopped my sentence, handing over to you in the middle of my sentence. Actually, my computer stopped working, so I'm back. So I would now hand over to Ralf Becker, who will tell us a little bit more about the thematic conferences. And so over to you, Ralf.
Thank you. So let me see if I can figure out the screen sharing here. This should be the one, I hope.
There's something coming up. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Good. A few words on the series of regional thematic conferences that we're organizing. They have already been mentioned by Gabriel in his presentation as an integral part, actually, of developing the handbook. But it's not where it stops. And I'll say a few words about that in a moment. So this series of regional thematic conferences has the title Managing a Statistical Organization in Times of Change. And it's geared towards chief statisticians or other senior officers, not only of the National Statistical Office, but of the National Statistical System. These conferences, of course, provide a very strong link to the handbook. They are supporting the handbook and also benefiting from the handbook. We are raising awareness of the handbook, and we share information on what is in there. But we're also using it to identify regional and sub-regional initiatives to reference in the handbook to provide a more complete picture of what is actually happening in the world of statistics. And we're using these conferences also to identify national good practices and challenges to inform the various chapters of the handbook. At the same time, of course, by bringing these issues up in the conferences, we're also validating the usefulness of the content to find out, is it right what we have in the handbook? Is this the right topic? Is this the right scope? Is there enough detail in there that we need for different countries? As Petra also just said, not all the countries are the same, so there's not always an interest in learning from one very developed countries how things work, but rather countries look at other countries in similar situations, neighboring countries, maybe even halfway around the world, that start from a similar point, have similar restrictions, similar limitations of resources, and so on, and try to learn from them. This is also what the thematic conferences try to do. So we're really looking here at, are we always capturing the right information in the handbook, also as we go along. But of course, the link to the handbook is not the only purpose of the thematic conferences. We're also shaping, coordinating, and cross-fertilizing, actually, modernization programs and actions at the global, regional, and sub-regional levels and between these levels. So it's an additional tool that we're using to bring more information or share more information about different activities that are going on in the world in the area of statistics that are actually important for top-level managers of statistical systems to know, to ensure that they can properly manage the operation of their systems. So the conferences we have already organized, they were structured along 4 cross-cutting themes covering all broad strategic areas of the Cape Town Global Action Plan, which now guides the work on capacity development in statistics, and also linking to the chapters of the updated handbook. So we were looking at the supporting the transformation of the statistical production process all the way through, the strengthening of institutional and organizational frameworks of national statistical systems. Very important, securing quality of statistical information and improving data coherence through statistical analysis and analytical frameworks. And of course, and this is very important for many countries, mobilizing and securing adequate resources and infrastructure and promoting regional and global cooperation for the development of national statistical capacity. So this was organized then in connection with the different chapters of the handbook. So each of these was broken down, and we tried to focus in on some of the key areas of these chapters of the handbook to get information from the participants, but also to provide information of what we already have in the current draft of the handbook. So all of this was organized in plenary sessions and breakout sessions to provide different opportunities to discuss critical issues in the conference. So the plenary sessions, of course, work very well if we talk about what is in the handbook, provide general information that leads, that brings the information to the others in the room, but it somehow limits a little bit, of course, the interaction that we can have. If we have 50 people in the room or even 30, it makes it a bit difficult. We also still have to consider that we have a slightly different audience from many other workshops that we do, because this conference is really designed for chief statisticians and senior managers of the national statistical systems. So what we wanted to do, of course, is to help or assist with this information sharing, experience sharing between countries, to have smaller groups that really force people to discuss, that really make it easier to share information rather than waiting for some person to talk and 50 others would like to respond but cannot really. So these breakout groups that we have created as part of the global conferences, the regional conferences, were a very important part of these discussions. So these breakout groups now have allowed for discussions among countries in similar situations, share actual experiences, and also identify and discuss problems that can then be brought back to the plenary group to see if there are other areas, other countries that can actually help or provide information, or even later on after the conference is completed, stay in contact with those countries to provide additional assistance. In these breakout groups, of course, we focus on very specific topics, so subsets of the conference topics, so that we can set priorities and also address details actually in there. So it's not a very general discussion, but really we're looking at details, how this is actually being done in different countries. I also have to say here that small groups actually worked well with participants that were connected online. Here we have to say that the last of the regional conferences that we did was just before COVID actually hit, but still a few countries were not able to attend in person. But it turns out that for the plenary session, when you have 30, 40, 50 people in the room and 10 are connected just virtually, it's very difficult to have them as a real part of the discussion. But for the smaller groups, it worked very well because we had smaller groups then consisting of 6, 7, 8 people, plus one person on the screen. That was much easier to do. Now, of course, we have to say that over time, we have also developed now over the last year and a half now, more skills in managing online participation. So this may actually also improve a little bit in the future. So these are just some pictures of the smaller groups where we are then actually discussing. And these discussions were usually quite lively because we actually looked at very specific topics. And we were also able then to bring back to the plenary session detailed information on how certain things work in countries, what works, what doesn't work. And this also then provides tools, assistance to other countries to find out how certain issues can be addressed by seeing how these have been handled in other countries and where other countries actually had problems. For instance, when this is just one example of the discussion that we had in the conference for the Caribbean, when we talked about administrative data, what are advantages, disadvantages, And we really see that countries had different experiences on things that worked and that didn't work. And it was very good to share this information to see that certain types of arrangements, for instance, with data sharing, data access with different ministries, work in some countries that can be taken over into others because they try to go a different way and basically can learn now from other countries what has actually worked better, what are the practical steps that can be taken to make these different arrangements, in this case, for instance, legal arrangements between different entities of the government, more functioning and more practical for our statistical work. When we look at future conferences now, so future themes, of course, we still want the thematic conferences to provide input for the content of the handbook. But of course, the process of the main drafting of the handbook has been completed for this initial release of the handbook. But there will always be new issues, practices, new success stories that need to be identified, not only to keep the handbook updated, that's a very important element, but also just for countries to hear what is going on, what have others done, have they made progress in one of these particular issues that we discussed before, where everybody was still a little bit stuck. So future conferences in that sense will focus more on changing areas that are most likely also specific to respective regions. It's already clear at this point that some of these changing areas will be very focused. For instance, IT issues will be something that have to be reviewed very frequently, also in the handbook, because it's an extremely fast changing area. What has been the best recommendation 2 years ago may be completely outdated now, and nobody will even remember what it was 5 years from now. So this is an area that certainly needs to be reviewed in a very very rapid timeline, basically, as Gabriel has also explained earlier how we see the process of the handbook going forward. Another fast-changing area is now also information about crisis situations. This has, of course, been discussed before. It's on everybody's mind, but we have often seen this in a more restricted way. We have usually weather phenomena, etc., that impact countries in different ways. Volcanic eruptions also have impacted countries. But now we're actually having practical experience that is being gathered right now on a crisis situation that has really affected the whole world. And it really goes through many of these aspects that we're discussing in the handbook and in these conferences. For instance, human resources management issues have to be looked at in a completely new way. And we have new experiences now from this COVID crisis. We also have to look at data management issues in a new way. Not only data storing, data security, now also data access. In some cases, of course, we now have learned, we have produced new techniques for remote access to data, but it's not always possible or advisable or even legal to do this because we have confidential data that we simply cannot allow people to access in any ways that are technically possible. So there are new discussions that we also have to have on really coming up with recommendations and learn from countries how they have properly managed this. And of course, all of this has to lead to resilient statistical methods, which is also a new area that we're developing now, that we're looking at now. How can we still produce the statistical information that we have to produce, that is our standard output, under these new changed conditions? So there are going to be some very interesting discussions that we need to have that will lead to updates in the handbook, but most importantly also lead to a fast information exchange between countries on how to manage these issues. Now, we still have to remember that these thematic conferences are for senior statisticians that actually have to manage these processes. We're not really looking at technical details all the time, but we have to ensure that we're providing the information to those that have to ensure that the overall process still works to produce reliable statistics, produce the standard outputs, but also react to new demands in terms of statistical needs. These are a few more groups that we had. You see small groups. We can easily break this up. The picture here is not very good. On the screen is actually another person that is participating in this meeting. So just a few words on the conferences that we have already done. We are planning to do these conferences, of course, in all regions in the world, without trying to get too many countries in there at the same time, so that we can still have reasonable ways of actually discussing between countries. So far, we have conducted 3 thematic conferences, one for African countries, for the English-speaking countries, one for the Caribbean, so a set of the small island developing states, and for the Asian countries, except for the Pacific Islands now. So those were successfully done. Information is available, and I show the website in a minute. But we still have plans for ongoing thematic conferences. Already in preparation have been 3 conferences that we now had to postpone due to the whole COVID situation. There was a conference for the Southeast and Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia region, which is planned to be now conducted in early 2022 in Uzbekistan. We are in discussions or in preparations with our partners to organize the Arab thematic conference in Palestine, also in early 2022. And we are in early stages of working on the Pacific Islands thematic conference with partners, of course, the Pacific Community and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and of course, always the regional commissions. Future plans, of course, will include the pending outstanding conferences for the Francophone Africa region and for Latin America. And of course, there will be a series of follow-up regional conferences where we look more at details of things that have changed. So all of these will be organized jointly with the respective regional commissions and other partners. And I have to mention here, since we broke up Africa, for instance, language issues also have really emerged as a very important thing to consider, because especially for the small breakout sessions, we want to have a fast, flexible, quick discussion, and always going through an interpretation process may a little bit a bottleneck for that. So these are all things that we're trying to take into account. Information on these regional thematic conferences is available on our website. You can go through the details for each of the conferences that are planned and those that have taken place. And the website can be accessed at this link, but I think we're sharing the presentations anyway as well. Good, this is it from my side. Back to you, Alexander.
Thank you so much, Ralf, also for this overview of the thematic conferences. We would now open up the floor for questions. So please feel free to either write the questions into the meeting chat, or you can also raise your hand in Teams. You can use that function, and then we can give you the floor to ask the questions. I think we can take maybe 10 minutes or so max for questions. So maybe I'll start first with one which was in the meeting chat by Jessamine. Unless, Jessamine, you want to unmute yourself.
Alex, yeah, just to say thanks to everyone for the great presentation. Congratulations on the work, Gabriel, on the handbook. Just noting, also appreciating that the title has been changed from Handbook or Management of NSOs to National Statistical Systems. Now wondering what would be the operational definition for the National Statistical Systems. I've seen before that the official definition has been inclusive only of data producers within the government system. I'm wondering how data users have been incorporated in this definition of NSS. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was Jessamine Encarnacion from the UN Women. Who would like to take this question? Gabriel?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yes, I mean, what we have changed is that the definition of the national statistical system remains on the producer of official statistics. Now, what we have also in the handbook, it's another concept which is the national data ecosystem, which is actually exactly to what you're referring. Now, why we have used I would say what you call the traditional, some people call it the restrictive version or definition, is just because this is the definition that we have in the National Quality Assurance Framework. It's a definition that we have in the different generic law of official statistics, and it's the easiest way actually to regulate the functioning of the national statistical system when it comes to the legal framework. So instead of creating confusion, having different definitions, we thought we keep this one, right? The national statistical system that is already not an obvious one, but we have an extension of that one. We have all the other producers, and I would call the intermediary users of statistics, the important one like researchers, as member of the data ecosystem.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. We had also during the sign-up process, we had a couple of questions in the sign-up form, and one of the questions there was also about how people can participate actively in the further development of the handbook. I mean, you've talked about those thematic conferences, but I guess the question was more geared towards the participation in the development of the handbook by other people who do not belong to the senior management of the national statistical offices.
Is it to me again? Yeah. What I can just say, I mean, and then Petra and Ralf can add, of course. I mean, we discussed the thematic conferences. We also discussed, and Petra presented it also beautifully. I mean, how useful the handbook is already now. I mean, we know. I mean, ESCAP is also a member of the advisory group. They're also collecting feedback from other events and meetings that they have, practical implementation of the handbook, and bringing that back to us so that we can work together on the update. And then the handbook is on wiki, and the new platform that is being developed is actually a platform that will allow constantly users to make us comments. And this is something that we believe is really important on top of what was presented today.
Thanks. This is very good to know, which will also make it probably easier to maintain the handbook over time. Then we had another question by Matavan Pellen. So there was a question whether we also incorporate automation methods and artificial intelligence methods for regular data gathering and processing in the handbook. And I see Matavan is also there. Yeah. So I don't know who wants to take that question.
It is discussed in the handbook, but from the perspective of a manager, right? We have to keep this in mind now. It's not from a perspective of a technician or an expert in artificial intelligence. It's from the perspective of a manager. But there, it is there. And as mentioned by Ralf, if he wants to add something, these are the domains that are going to change quickly, right? And where we need the feedback through the thematic conferences, but also through other events that we are going to organize jointly.
Yeah, maybe I can add to, because then we also get into this interesting type of discussion here, similar to what we see now in the whole discussion, the work on big data. There's of course always a technical aspect. How can I actually extract this information? What kind of techniques do I need to have? What are the programming skills? What information can I get out? But before we can actually start the other questions, under what circumstances are we allowed to use this type of information? How can we obtain this type of information? What is actually acceptable to be used to provide information that goes into official statistics? And these are then, of course, questions that have to be decided at the management level. This is what the handbook and the conferences address. The noise didn't come from me. I don't know where.
Yeah, somebody has their microphone. Can you please make sure that you're muted if you're not speaking? I cannot find right now the sorry if I have now muted everybody, but that was the quickest way of solving this. So do we have additional questions? I know we are already slightly over time, but I can, Gabriel waves his hand. You can unmute yourself again. So.
Thank you. I just wanted also to thank the colleagues that were in the drafting team, Michael College, former Statistics Australia, Marko Kristof, former head of Statistics Croatia, Hallgrímur Snorason, former head of Statistics Iceland, Marge Guerrero, former head of Statistics in ESCAP, Helge Jeskanen Sundström, former chief statistician of Finland, Heinrich Brunker, former head of UNEC Statistics, Jan Bufligen from Statistics Norway, and also Trevor Fletcher, ex-OECD and Paris 21. And I wanted also to thank Eurostat, EFTA, and of course the development account 10th tranche that through their direct and financial contributions made this handbook possible. Thank you very much. That I just wanted to, give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar.
Yeah, that's very good. So I don't see any further questions right now, but I can for sure say that we will share the presentations and the recording of this session as always on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians. I see one hand up, but let me finish maybe that sentence, and there we can also share the link to the handbook. We have done that already, and we can also answer further questions that you might have related to the handbook, to the thematic conferences, and the further drafting and editing process. So maybe we can take one final question. I see Misha Belkinas. Not sure if you want to unmute yourself. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting webinar. I just have one question and maybe a comment. I mean, what I'm lacking is to understand the relationship between the new handbook which you are producing and the fundamental principles of official statistics. And I mean, in a very open and how to say bold way, because what's happening in the world these days, it's not an issue of functioning of a national statistical system. It's a technical functioning. It's an issue of ethical problems. It's an issue of legal problems, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to, I don't want to put Gabriel on the stand right now, but I just want to, but I see he's happy to be there. But the question I would say that this is for future discussion. And one suggestion I would have, where I'm wearing now the hat as the incoming president of IAOS, that we would love to have the panel about the handbook on the 2022 IAOS conference in Krakow. And we will try, our organizers that will try to contact Gabriel and see how we can arrange that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Misha. I mean, chapter 3, 4, and 5, but in particular 3 is mainly about the fundamental principles. It's very important what you are saying, because this is true that we see the handbook, or some people see the handbook more from a technical perspective, even though it's a handbook for managers. But I mean, what remained the core of the handbook are the principle of official statistics, the values and the trust that the user put in official statistics, which makes actually the difference between official statistics and other kind of statistics. Thank you, Misha, for this.
Thanks so much, Misha. And by this, we now conclude this session of the Global Network webinars. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thanks so much to Gabriel, Ralf, Petra, for presenting today and sharing the experience on the Handbook of Statistical Organization. And please join us again next time when we have our next Global Network webinar, which will be announced as always on the Global Network itself. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.